and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. This is your host, Julia, and today we're going to explore the question, can astrology help you determine when you're going to get pregnant? Amazingly, the fertility astrologer, as she's known, Nicola Smuts Allsop, actually says yes. And I can tell you, I've done a reading with her and had a very in-depth interview with her, which you'll now hear the interview portion. And it's amazing what your chart can show. She has determined a way to look at your chart and to predict over the next 3 years when you're going to have a little bit more luck. So when might that IVF treatment be a little bit more likely to succeed? Moreover, and this is really fascinating, she can look at your chart and say you might be having a sperm motility issue or a sperm morphology issue. You might be having a tube issue. You might have endometriosis or some other thing. She can see a lot of those things in your chart. And while she's not a doctor, she can definitely encourage you to ask the right questions to your doctor. So this is a really, really fascinating episode. Interestingly, in addition to the question, can astrology predict when you're going to get pregnant? There's also the question, how much does luck and how much does self-perception or quote unquote, the placebo effect play a role in things like getting pregnant? Does that mean that if a fertility treatment is not working, it's your psychology and your brain, and if you would just relax or change your mindset, it would work? Absolutely not. But does that mean that there's some sort of unknown element that we should be exploring? Maybe it's a placebo effect. Maybe it's our mentality or mindset. Maybe it's astrology or luck. Maybe. I don't know. Take a listen, make a determination for yourself. And as always, if you love this episode, please don't forget to share it with friends. You never know who might need to book that appointment with the fertility astrologer. And also, don't forget to leave a great review wherever you listen to podcasts and follow us on social media. Thank you. And here's Nicola. Welcome to Stork'd, the podcast in which we explore all the many ways to build and define family. I am so excited to have Nicola with me here today to talk about fertility astrology, and we're going to learn what that means. Nicola, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive into the work that you do?
Well, I'm a mom. Actually, I'm a grandmother, and I have 2 adult daughters who are in their 30s, and I became an astrologer. I started studying regular astrology, I think, when I was about 36. And at the time, I was embarking already on my own fertility journey. But the fertility aspect, I didn't realize that astrology could help fertility. So I was just learning regular astrology. And as I started learning my astrology, so I started getting clients and I started predicting pregnancies. And then when those pregnancies came to be, I just got a reputation for it. And so I then started dealing with people who struggle. So most of my adult working life as a professional astrologer has been working with people who struggle to fall pregnant.
You're being very humble here by saying, I just started with astrology and then I just found my way into fertility astrology. I think we should unpack that a little bit. I think it's very interesting that you chose astrology later in life, right? Sometimes we have this message that we have to know exactly what we're going to do with our careers and with our life's purpose in our 20s. Can you tell us about how you discovered astrology and, the ways in which it intersected with where you were in your life at that time?
Okay, that's a great story because it really is a lovely backstory. I was married to my first husband, and I had when I left school, I started doing a degree in languages, basically. So I majored English, German, I did French, Italian, Portuguese, and Afrikaans 1, which was our local language at home. And it sounds very impressive, but actually I only really remember German, English, and I can read French. But we went with my first husband to he was selling property on a golf course resort. And because of my German, I was able to help him sort of co-host because he was selling obviously to several German people who were there. And they couldn't tell the golf course interior designers how they wanted their properties or their lodges done. So they used to drag me along. And then I'm a bit bossy and a little bit creative and a little bit vocal. So I would tell them, no, I think you should do this and I think you should do that. And eventually the architects on the project said, you're really good at this. Do you not want a job here? So I said, no, this sounds fantastic. Okay, I'll have a job here. So I started working as an interior designer for them for the golf course. And what I realized was it's just always language. Language has always gotten me into something. and interpreting what people want and managing their expectations and understanding and getting to really empathize with them. If you can put yourself in somebody's shoes, you can and really understand who they are. It involves listening, and it involves not wanting to necessarily project what you want onto them, but helping them get more of what they want for them. So that was like a really lovely experience for me. And then I did that for about 5 years. And then one thing led to another. My first marriage wasn't particularly happy, shall we just say. It was a challenging marriage. And I once went to a tea leaf lady just in this process. And this tea leaf lady said to me something about, she was very effusive about, I don't know, the amount of love that was in the cup that she was looking at. And she said, you know, you are going to live an extraordinary life and you'll have whatever you want and you will do this and you'll do that. And it was so foreign and it was so distant from what I was actually living that I couldn't really quite believe it. And she also saw that I was going to get divorced. She mentioned that my husband was a bully. And it was funny because on reflection, I can see this. Once words are spoken and you have somebody who's witnessing them, they then become real. They become issues that you have to deal with. They're not the things that you can squash back inside and not focus on. I went, oh, okay, that's really interesting. Now I have to deal with this. And so that got me on the step to kind of dealing with it, which was to kind of recognize that this is, and one of the reasons why I went to the tea leaf lady in the first place was I'd had to have some very strong visions and dreams about how my father-in-law, my first husband's father, was going to die. And obviously they are troubling. So I went to her and she validated that for me. But it's very difficult to come back home from a tea leaf lady, go to your husband and say, having some dreams about your father dying. I went to a tea leaf lady and she validated that and that you're a bully and that I'm going to leave you. And so this is going to happen. So I couldn't package that into words. So I knitted my father-in-law a jumper and managed to give it to him before he passed away. And he actually did die in exactly the manner that I saw. And so that happened, but then there were issues. And so obviously death and grief, like they expose cracks in your marriage, shall we say, and they just pushed me out of sooner than maybe I was ready to, but I left. But it was kind of, those visions were they were troubling because I'd often get knowing this is about other people and you want to know, is it my stuff? Is it their stuff? Where does this come from? So I kind of put it like on the back burner and I got to Cape Town, and then through book clubs and chatting to other people, I got in touch with a chap in Johannesburg, an older man who was a healer, and he helped me understand. And I mostly was on the phone. We didn't even have dial-up internet in those days. And then he taught me tarot, and which is great because then I could make sense of something. I had a tool to make meaning of the world, but tarot is really interesting. It tells you what, but it doesn't necessarily tell you when. It's not as punctual as something like astrology. Astrology is the grandest clock that you'll ever come across. So knowing when bad times are going to start and when they're going to end was for me infinitely more practical than knowing just what the bad stuff was. Yeah, we all have bad stuff. I just want to know when's it going to be over. So along this way, a friend of mine who now I was fully into interior design because I'd been fully trained. So I came back to Cape Town. I opened my own interior design company. And interior design is not unrelated from astrology because it's pattern making. It's scale and pattern making. So it's kind of similar language. So I had somebody who had been to one of Cape Town's best astrologers. And she said, you got to see this guy. I know it's just going to be great. But it takes a year to see him. And, just book now and then you'll get in. I said, okay, fine. So I went off and I phoned this chap. And as it happened, our charts are almost identical. And he was so surprised when I said my birthday on the phone that he went, oh, yeah, you can come next week. And off I went to see this astrologer. And he told me everything. He told me my whole life back. I gave him at the time of birth and he could time all the divorce. He could time everything. I thought, no, this is really practical. So I'm a Capricorn and kind of we like things that we can use. Practicality is everything.
You like the tangible. Do you see a mirror in your readings for others where when you give voice to something you're seeing, they're like, oh, yes, that's the feeling or the sensation that I've been experiencing, but I haven't yet put it into words?
A lot. I think a lot. And I think it's really important that we have a witness on our journeys. And I think we don't feel, especially in fertility, that we can tell everybody our truth. It's shameful to be infertile. It's embarrassing. It's personal, intimate stuff. So the opportunity for you to have a witness on your journey, they're slim. the chances are slim you're going to have that witness.
Mm-hmm.
So when people come to me, I not only witness the physical journey because they have to give me a medical history of what they're trying and what they've been through, hardship that they've been through. It's like a witness to their personality and how they are in their relationship and what the fertility means to them and how they see themselves in this process. Not everyone's going to be successful. You have to lead someone there. You can't necessarily, that can't be the first words out of your mouth. It's just like the tea leaf lady probably waited for the right moment and then she was able to say it. She gave me hope by telling me I had so much love in my cup. And then, by the way, your husband's a bully, but don't worry, you can have another one. I see you with a 6-foot man walking hand in hand on a beach. So there's like, I think we have to lead people to give them hope that there is a future, be it with children or without children, or sometimes with the children that you didn't expect to have, like donor egg or, donor embryo or things like that.
It really strikes me in your story, just how you hold these big moments of truth, whether or not you get to have a kid, the sense of self-identity that comes with it. I'm talking about your clients now, the relationships and the feeling states that they have. You hold all that with a sense of practicality. And it sort of sounds to me like you did the same thing with your marriage. Okay, it wasn't working. He was a bully. I wasn't happy. I really didn't feel like I could have these things. And yet I can have another one. There's a balance between holding the emotional and being very practical in the way you talk about these big moments, having kids, maybe not having kids, divorce, marriage. How does that resonate to you?
It's very astute of you to notice that. Now, I think that a certain amount of wisdom is being able to live in a paradox. We are not black and white individuals. We don't do this or that. We sometimes do a bit of both. So it's kind of like, I am simultaneously very practical, but also incredibly intuitive. So I've got Pisces rising, Pisces moon, Capricorn sun. They are two very disparate situations. So it's just interesting being a person with those contradictions already in my chart. So it's not that I don't feel the trauma or the unhappiness or the whatever. It's just, it seems to me that when I do feel that, I step into practicality. And for me, stepping into action. So for me, emotions translate into action. So for me, that at least moves me forward on a journey. So I try and do that for other people because it's worked for me. And I think also it's just sometimes the step that other people need. Just literally somebody taking their hand saying, walk across the bridge, walk with me. It's going to be fine.
And that action, it's so hard. And translating something into action, even if it's a very small action step, regains that sense of control. We've talked about how when you're trying for a baby or you want a marriage to work or whatever may be going on in your life, you have that sense that your life is out of your control. You don't necessarily have the ability to tell your uterus you have to function, your sperm has to function, I want to have this baby. So the practicality aspect, I'm harping on that because if somebody were to listen to this episode and say, what am I going to get from hearing about fertility astrology? I don't know that they would immediately grasp, I'm going to get practicality. Does that make sense? Like, I think we think of astrology as so witchy and woo-woo, and yet here you're offering a package that says, I can help you cross the bridge. I can hold your hand and I can give you some action items. That's interesting to me,
I did a research paper once through the University of Lampeter, and it was on, so I just did a sort of a qualitative on what my previous patients or clients thought about astrology for whom astrology had worked. And it was addressing two issues. It was addressing the issue of the fact that people often accuse astrologers of taking advantage of the weak and the gullible and exploiting people. So what was interesting is, I asked 22 people and 11 responded. And of those 11, I think all of them had a tertiary education. There were 2 PhDs. There was a research scientist, a chemical engineer, an architect, and another normal mechanical engineer. So these are people who are clearly not stupid, and we can't call them weak and gullible. Don't fit that profile. So that was the first interesting thing. The other thing is that in conclusion, one of the conclusions was most of them felt that a consultation with myself or an astrologer who would give you like predictive time periods at which to focus your fertility on, they all felt that it gave them a plan. Up until then, they didn't have a plan. They just had what they thought their doctor was going to tell them. So most people have got 3 opportunities a year, financially, through leave or other circumstances, in order to have IVF treatment. And it's not really the doctor's concern when you have them. So it's up to you to choose. And that puts a lot of pressure on a couple, especially if you don't know what the plan is. And so to come to an astrologer and say, well, these are the moments where you're going to be most lucky, and this is when you could focus your attempts, at least gives them something external to hang it on. So they don't then, if something fails, they don't then blame their partner. Well, you chose that time and look, it failed. They can blame me. I don't mind if they blame me. They can say it's the astrologer's fault. Picked a bad time. So it kind of like creates a buffer, but it also gives people, okay, this is what we're doing this year. And I think people like that. I think people, yeah, like you said, now they book it in. Now they've got a phone call. A decision has been made.
It gives you a roadmap. Well, so I don't want to ignore the fact that you've got these big momentous life things happening, and we sort of stopped the story, I would say like 25% of the way there. But while we're here, let's talk about fertility astrology. The first thing I want to ask is, there's a lot of skeptics out there. There are the skeptics who say you're going to take advantage of somebody who's in a most vulnerable moment, and you've sort of addressed that. And then there are those who say, what is this woo-woo stuff? How is that going to help me in something that's a very medical experience? In fact, I have a dear friend, a partner of mine, who I asked to do a fertility astrology reading with you. He said, I do not want some witchy nonsense dictating my life. Right? What is your response to the naysayers? How would you encourage somebody to take that first step and consider fertility astrology as a tool?
Okay, so the way in which the medical field responds to me is largely in two camps. So those who know me, respect my work, respect how ethical and professional I am, and who don't have a problem at all, and actually just wish that every one of their patients went to see me because I actually help them. They see that I've already had the God talk, I've already done the psychological defragging and the packaging, and by the time the patient comes, they're well versed in what IVF is, what it's going to be like, and they're saying, right, I just want my treatment here, here, and here. So those people who know me and work with me, they want all of their people to see me. The other people are slightly threatened because they imagine that I'm trying to sell astrology as some kind of science. So the first thing I want to say is that I have spent a lot of time. I did a master's at Christchurch, Canterbury University, and my dissertation was on astrology as a narrative construct that behaves as a sophisticated placebo. And I think that I just need to define what I mean by placebo. So there's a group of Dutch academics, and I'm headed by a chap called Professor Daniel Moorman, Ted Kapczyk. There's Tanya Lerman. There's a few people, academics from around the world. I'm talking from Stanford University all the way through. And they meet in Amsterdam every now and again, and I go to their conferencing. And every speaker gets up, and these are medical doctors in all different fields. And they get up and they all say, and we tried this, and the placebo effect outperforms everything on the market. So if a medical treatment is 100% successful, 25% of that success can be attributed to the surgery or the drug, and 75% of every successful treatment is attributed to some kind of placebo response. So they've divided up all the placebo responses into inert placebos, active placebos, all sorts of things. So it's how professional the doctor is, how long the doctor looked you in the eye and gave you sustained eye contact. Did the doctor touch your arm? Did the doctor mention you or call you by name more than 3 times? Was there a nice big fat Persian and a lovely mahogany desk and 20 certificates on the wall? Were the premises where you went to have your treatment clean? And all of those little things have meaning to us as people, and we clocking them and registering them, and that determines our response to the treatment that we're getting. The size of the pill, whether it's injection, whether it's given to you in the morning or the afternoon, all of those things have the most amazing impact on how successful a treatment is. So when I was looking at this, I went into the psychodynamic talking skills section of the placebo thing.
Sorry. This is so important, and I'm just gobsmacked because I'm not a scientist, but if I'm understanding you correctly, 75% success rate is attributable to these small, tiny little things. Yeah. What I'm hearing as a non-scientist is that those things go into our psyche and they let us believe this is going to work. Yeah. This is a clean environment, or I feel safe with this doctor. I feel seen by this doctor. I feel heard by this doctor. Is that a fair interpretation?
Totally. And there's a guy called David Jopling who wrote the most definitive book on placebo. And he talks about a trigger to self-repair. So he posits that we actually have internally a trigger to self-repair, and it just needs to be triggered by something. And very often it can just be a multitude of and lots of contributing factors. So what I wanted to do then with astrology was to say, well, I don't want to be part of science because that's 25%. They're not even in the winning part of the team. I want to be with the placebo people. And I started researching it, and then the very word placebo, when you go and look up the etymology of it, the word placebo means, and I shall please the Lord's my God. And it comes from the very first words of the Catholic Vespers for the Office of the Dead. And if you go look at my thesis, I further uncover the link between the Catholic Vespers, which are an afternoon prayer set to the setting Venus in the sky, has got a direct correlation with the Mesopotamian first original myth of Inanna and Ereshkigal that is written in cuneiform on a stone.
So it's amazing because honestly, had I got into this conversation and you said, I'm going to talk about placebo effects, I would have assumed that you wouldn't want to associate astrology with placebo. You would want to say, here's the science, and it's rooted in these traditions that are centuries old. And yet here you're saying placebo is a good thing. And in fact, it's rooted in being seen. It's rooted in compassion. It's rooted in empathy. And just by bearing witness in the same way that the tea leaf woman did for you, you can support somebody in your journey. And astrology is your tool to bear witness. It's just amazing to me. And what's also amazing to me, and I don't know if the audience is picking up on this, is how deeply researched your work is and how rooted it is in many cultures. And I think that's very, very important because it's easy to dismiss something as a pseudoscience and say, whatever, witchy woo-woo, whatever. But in fact, you're giving us scientists, you're giving us names, you're giving us parables and deep historical references that contextualize astrology in the broader world.
Yeah.
So let's say somebody hears this episode and they say, okay, I'm convinced. Maybe there is something to this fertility astrology thing. And they book an appointment with you. What can they expect? What is a fertility astrology reading? What does that feel like? What is it composed of?
Okay, so firstly, I want to say in the context of somebody struggling to get pregnant, I just want to say, so the cost of IVF, as you know, could be what, $5,000, £5,000. It's a lot of money to have these treatments.
Quite a lot more. It can be up to 20 grand depending on.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just saying that now you're going to be asked as a person to pay this doctor who's going to tell you that you basically only have a 65 to 75% success rate using IVF, and you have to do 3 rounds of IVF in order to get that success rate, but he's asking 20 grand a time. Okay. Now compare that to a reading with me for £350 for 3 years worth of predictions that basically describes time cycles of planets that can be described as good luck or bad luck. So basically what we want to do is we want you to be having your treatment when you have got the most luck or when the planet that brings the most luck visits luck to your chart in a way. So you don't have to believe in astrology for the astrology to work. You must just understand astrology is a big clock, the biggest clock in the universe, and you're timing your activity to be when it's most lucky. So it's a big benefit for a relatively small amount compared to the investment you're already making. So that's like one way to say to people, not that expensive. You only need to come once every 3 years. You don't need to ever see me again. So there's that. I think, like I said to you before, when people come to me, there's a way to look at the chart to understand, like, why am I infertile? So people want to know, like, what is the meaning of my infertility? Why am I infertile? What is it in my chart that makes me infertile? And when I can say to them without them having prompted me, yes, I can see an endocrine issue here or an endocrine, they go, oh, okay. So if this astrology is right or astrology is correct in being able to predict the reason why I'm not falling pregnant, then astrology must also be able to predict when I'm going to get pregnant. Not so. If astrology is accurate in one aspect, it could be accurate in another. So there's trust building in terms of like validating the person's physical being and like a physical diagnosis, if you like. And then there's an opportunity to talk about issues that you can't talk about with your doctor. Like, my mother was a horrible mother and I don't want to be the same. Can I talk to you about that? And is the fact that I have fear about being a mother, is that the thing that's stopping me from getting pregnant? You sound silly when you talk to an IVF doctor about that because he's got 15 minutes to deal with you.
For sure.
But you can say it to me because I'm just the astrologer, the woohoo astrologer. So nothing sounds silly to ask me. The questions that I get asked are like quite, and I would never say they're stupid. It's just that people think deeply, but they're not given, like I said, the opportunity to voice it. A lot of people, you'd be surprised, a lot of people are concerned that IVF is what they call playing God. Everyone uses that expression, like, are we playing God? And I'm going, well, yes and no. We're using the technology that has been given to us, you can say, by use of our brains and what have you. I want to always reassure people that we can get your body all the way up to implantation, but we still no one's ever witnessed a conception, and no one has ever been able to predict exactly when a conception happens. So there's always that window. Even when we put the embryo back in, it's still up to the universe to conceive. It's not up to us. There's still that little window for whatever faith factor people would like to have. But like I said, that's a difficult conversation to start with a doctor when you have 5 or 10 minutes to chat.
It's so difficult. And what are some of the unusual charts or the unusual stories that you feel comfortable sharing with us?
Well, I mean, my 2 favorites, I have 2 favorites. So the one favorite of mine is the first one in my book, which is the story of Amanda. I met her at a cocktail party and she came to me for some career advice. I gave her some career advice. It all panned out. She was very impressed. She came back. She said, now I've got the real question. I was just testing you. I went, okay. Now, bear in mind, I was in my second year of astrology. I still had like a year and a half to go in my studies, but I'm overconfident and over mouthy. So I said, yeah, okay, fine. I'll do your chart. So she came and said to me, I want to have a baby. I'm going to adopt, and the adoption clinic are going to interview. I'm a CEO of a listed company, and they're going to interview like my colleagues to see if I'm fit to be a mom. And I actually can't bear the embarrassment and the invasion. So if I'm not going to have a baby according to astrology, then I don't want to go through that process. So I said, okay, give me the chart. Anyway, I look at the chart and I said to her, you know what? I got a story for you. You are going to visit your ex-husband on January the 8th, and you're going to have a baby. And she said, you weren't really paying attention, were you? Because the ex-husband and I tried for 5 years to have a baby. His sperm was no good. It broke up our marriage. And I've had four or five rounds of treatment on my own as a single person, and it still hasn't worked. And I'm now 43 years old. So I don't think so. So I said, well, come back to me in another month. Maybe I'll have another story, because I'm a bit fixated on the story now. So come back again. So about 2 weeks later, she phones me and she says, you can't believe it. She said, my sister is immigrating to another country, and my ex-husband, who lives in Dubai, he has phoned me and he's asked me, he said, you must be very upset that your sister's immigrating. Why don't you come visit me on this weekend? And it's the very weekend that you said. What must I do? So I said, well, if you want to get pregnant, pack your bags, my friend. And off you go. She said, yeah, but he might have a girlfriend and it's awkward having sex with your ex. And I'm going, well, I don't have another story, but just get there. Anyway, she went, and within 20 minutes, obviously they were, spent the rest of the weekend together. And she came back home. And the next thing she comes and says, well, my period is late. So I'm saying, and? So she said, and what? I said, well, get a pill. Anyway, so she was pregnant. I predicted that she would have sex on January the 8th and have a baby on the 26th of September, but she ended up having a baby on the 23rd, which is my daughter's birthday. So that was my first pregnancy, and that was the one that kind of set me on this path. But another lovely, lovely story is that sometimes charts you can read a chart that where it's reflected different ways. So Jupiter is a planet that brings babies, and it brings recognition, and it brings all the good things, winnings, money, success. Yeah. So I had this woman who was also quite a high profile lady in the pharmaceutical industry, and she wanted to have a baby. She didn't want to be married, and she was trying with donor sperm. She had a few embryos, but she just wasn't having any luck. Like, she'd had about 3 rounds and nothing was working. And she told me that she was having an affair, and she'd had this long-standing affair, like about 6 years, with this other guy. And she didn't want to marry him. He just traveled, and like once a month they'd get together, but she didn't want to disturb his family. And she said, and it's really upsetting because the more I try, it's like every time his wife turns around, the wife gets pregnant. So I'm saying, is the wife pregnant now? She said, yeah, she just got pregnant. So I said, and he knows that you're trying with donor sperm to get pregnancy. He's not upset about the fact that you're going to have a baby. She said, no. I said, well, then I think you must have a baby with him, because he's the one that's fertile at the moment. His chart is screaming Jupiter, Jupiter, Jupiter. So she said, good point. Yeah. So she went back to him and she said, you know that I'm trying for a baby. So we're having unprotected sex, but I'm also trying IVF. And if anything happens, I don't expect you to be responsible. And of course, he didn't really take her seriously. So they continued to have a sexual relationship without protection, and she got pregnant the very next month. And it ended up very happily. I don't know if they're still together. That was 20 years ago, but she's parented her son. And for me, it was like just a case of like omen reading across charts. Like, I'll never forget the time, for instance, when Roger Federer was at Wimbledon, and people said, who's going to win? And I said, Roger Federer's wife is pregnant with twins. He's going to win. He's having a Jupiter transit. And then he wins, because you just know. Jupiter's sitting with that guy over there. So it's just interesting to see, like, across things.
One of the things that you do so well is pattern recognition. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions regarding that. One of the things I'm curious about is, are you noticing a trend in the types of patients that come to you? Are they typically those people who have been trying for a really long time and they're just at their wits' end? They're like, this is the last stop. Or are they people who are curious about this God question and whether they're playing God or whether there's some sort of mystical interference by using science and technology? What are some of the themes that you're noticing in the reasons people seek out a fertility astrologer?
So one of the themes, a couple of themes that I see, and over the 20 years that I've been in practice, is that there are generational cycles. So for people born in 1965, we are all born with Pluto, Uranus opposite Saturn, all in Virgo, Pisces. So a lot of the early fertility issues were all tube-related because it's in Virgo, which is ruled by Mercury, which rules the fallopian tubes. So everything was tube-related. And so all the treatments were tube-related. So you even had Zift and Gift where they'd actually put like the egg and the sperm in the tube. They were like so focused on putting it actually in the tube. It was very, very, very tube-related. And then Pluto moves on into Libra, and then we have all the endometriosis people. Because Libra is a sign of creativity, but it's female creativity. And then Pluto's there and it's blocking female creativity. So it's these people who are creatively blocked. They're stuck in jobs that they don't really like, but it's a generation where they feel thwarted in some way. And sometimes that reflects back in the body, depending where Pluto is in the chart. Not everybody with Pluto in Libra will have endometriosis, but it was much more common. And at the same time, it's much more common because technology moves forward and we can now pick up 2-millimeter fibroids where we couldn't 10 years before. So all of a sudden, endometriosis suddenly becomes like, this is the reason why no one's getting pregnant. And so we move. So now I'm just starting to see the Pluto in Scorpio, and Scorpio rules also the reproductive organs. So now I'm expecting more practical, physical. I'm expecting to see people with strange shaped uteruses or actual things, maybe more with the Pluto generation. But I'm also seeing like a generation of Saturn Neptune people in the 80s, early 80s and sort of late 88. And those Saturn Neptune people are people who, they're the ones who are challenging our sort of gender fluid kind of ideas about family. Because Saturn is boundaries and structure, and Neptune is something that's deeply eroding but dissolving, and it's much more fluid. And when we get that, we're going, we've got Neptune is going to be like completely undermining and sort of like making the patriarchy, which is Saturn, fluid. So now we've got like fluid families, and it's been put into law. Saturn is like very much about manifesting something in law. So those generations are pushing those boundaries, like all those rules are dissolving. So that's another new kind of manifestation, that I'm seeing. As an astrologer, I will always get people who don't like doctors at all. And so I do get the people who want to do everything naturally. It's hippie culture. So it's people who really don't want to even take a paracetamol. They just want to take their herbs, and they have avoided medical science at all costs. But sometimes because they've avoided it, they're not so educated about their actual fertility. So they're coming to me at 45 and they're saying, well, I look very young. My eggs must be very young, so it can't be a problem. And I'm going, okay, challenge. And then there's a bit of a scurry because I've got to kind of get them up to speed about where their fertility actually is. So there's a lot of people who are like that, and a lot of people who have left it late. But we're also having a lot of second and third marriages where it's now, people are coming and saying, it's taken me a while to get settled in my job, and it's taken me a while to find Mr. Right, but now I'm ready and I'm 42. Can you help me? So yeah, it's hard. But I would say the average age of the person who comes to me is 40. I wish they were going to be 25 or 30, but yeah, the average age is 40.
Which is exactly when I came to you. This is so interesting. It's interesting to think about the generational changes. It's interesting to think about the ways in which astrology and cultural shift are affecting fertility, right? The gender fluidity is one example, and then the emphasis on finding the right partner, getting your career sorted first. And so people like me who are starting a little bit later in life, I've listened to some of your really deep analysis, and it was over my head, but it was really fascinating. And as far as I can tell, there are some patterns that you recognized before other astrologers did. Can you talk to us about the path that you took to identify some of the patterns that you're seeing? And then some of the things that you see in the charts. So for instance, I remember hearing that there are certain correlations you found between sperm motility and somebody's chart, or the number of eggs in somebody's chart, or even thyroid issues in somebody's chart. Can you unwind some of that for us or demystify
So
it?
firstly, I don't think that I can claim that I was the first to see such signatures in a chart. But what I can say was that I have been the first to reinterpret that information from ancient astrology into modern practices like IVF and infertility treatment today. And one of the reasons why I think I might have been successful at that is that I actually went through IVF myself as an astrologer. So I had an eye out for myth and symbolism. So I wanted to see the symbolism of what was happening along the way. So that was an interesting journey just in itself. So going to things like, let's start with the sperm issue. So everybody who studies normal and regular astrology will know that Saturn is a planet that it limits, its authority figures, its obstacles and its delays, and it holds people back. And then for a man, the virility or your sperm is Mars. So where you get Saturn, who's having a mathematical relationship with Mars in the chart, that is quite clearly defined by all kind of normal astrology rules, then I can say, okay, so now what we have is we're having some kind of authority figure. We're having somebody's holding somebody back. This feels like a motility issue. So then I go, okay, well, Saturn, Mars, that's motility. So now what would be morphology? Because we've got different aspects of sperm. So the morphology is kind of what I looked at is the actual physical morphology issue is that sometimes there's a double head and sometimes the head has got a cap on it. And the cap has to come off the head of the sperm in order to produce an enzyme that softens the outside of the egg so that the sperm can actually get into the egg. Mm-hmm. So now that's kind of like something where I looked and then suddenly I realized that in most normal astrology, again, modern astrology, you will see that people who've got a Mars moon aspect in their chart are people who attract feisty women into their lives. And because the Mars is like feisty and the moon in a man's chart is the woman in your life, your mother, your partner, and your children. And then I thought, okay, so if I had a feisty mother, what might my feisty mother do? She might emasculate me. She might make me embarrassed about my sexuality, in which case the head of my sperm just goes, this has been one of my most successful kind of signature spotting. I mean, I've lost count of the times that I've had that conversation and I've gotten pregnant on the next cycle. Because sperm gets reproduced fresh every 72 days. So if you can change the way a man has a paradigm shift in his thinking about himself, his sexuality, and his wife, in 3 months' time, 72 days, you've got a fresh batch. So that's your best window, I think, with those kinds of markers. And then, of course, you've got Neptune, Mars. And if you get Neptune, Mars, you get a couple of issues. And that's kind of usually autoimmune disorders. But it's also maybe that your sperm's going to get frozen because Neptune rules cryotherapy and cryotechnology, which is the freezing of things. And Neptune also sometimes it can affect count. So that's where it might be because you can't see it. So there's an absence of. And also sometimes if you get a Neptune, Moon and Mars, that's chromosomal integrity issues. That's defragmentation. And then we're dealing with something a lot more complex because Neptune governs everything that we can't see. And so sometimes I can't see, I'm not a medical doctor, but it's also something that medical doctors sometimes can't see. So that's when you're having countless rounds of implantation, but nothing happens. Seemingly grade 1 embryos and that kind of issue. But going back to like those broader signatures, I just want to revisit this again because how we are as a culture and a society has got a direct impact on what happens in astrology and then vice versa. The dialogue gets repeated back to us. So what's happened is that since the 1960s, we've been having many more Caesar births. So what's happened is that many more people's time of birth is now sort of between 11 and say 2 in the afternoon. So you've got a high propensity. So that is the 11th house, 10th house, and 9th house. So those houses rule so that a 9th house is like travel and tertiary education. The 10th house is involved with being out there in the world and like a corporate life and being involved in like society as a whole. And the 11th house is also still quite, they're conferencing friends, like they're very extroverted houses. So what we've stopped having is because we're not giving birth that much at night anymore. We don't have sun signs that desperately want to be at home. We don't have the sun sign that says, I want to be a stay-at-home mom. We don't have sun signs that say, I'm prepared to work with my communities on a much smaller level. Everybody wants to be the huge big guy who's the hero of the day. Every like youngster I know wants to be Elon Musk. Everybody wants to be that person. Nobody wants to stay at home and keep the home fires burning. So this is how we've changed society. So what I've noticed is that women who are born with their sun in the 10th house, for instance, what they do is they create for themselves a corporate life where they have financial independence and they have a job or an identity that means that they're serving the greater good, which in turn makes sense of who they are in the world. And that's when they start delaying child rearing. And then what furthermore happens is that because they pay half for the house, they pay half for the holidays, nobody's upset until she has to take time off work to have children. She hasn't told her husband how much she spends on shoes and creams and Botox and blah. And now she's got to ask him for money. And that's a big problem. That's worse than having sex with a stranger.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like you have to say to couples, you have to say, listen, at this point, she's risking her life in order for the family to be created. And you need to respect that by just paying an X amount of money into her account every month and no questions asked. That's the way that you're going to get this person who's born with a 10th house sun to have children. It's because she needs a certain amount of financial independence without the asking, without the feeling like you've got to justify. So it's a sensitive issue.
Wow. So it's amazing that your work touches not just how your body is functioning, but also how you feel about sex, how you feel about your mom, how you feel about your financial independence, how you feel about your career. I mean, this is heavy stuff you're tackling through the guise of let's get you pregnant if we can.
Well, astrology has a comment on absolutely everything and anything. So whatever question you have, I've got the astrology to look at it.
Do you ever look at somebody's chart and say, I don't know how to tell you this, but I don't think it's going to happen for you?
There have been times that I've been really worried and concerned. I'm usually not really worried and concerned on a physical level because if people have, it's all dependent on, it's sad to say, but here we are with medicine, how wonderful it is. We can have a uterus transplant. We can have donor embryos. We can have all sorts of things. So usually it's about the tenacity of the person and the access they have to the resources they need. So if somebody is like one of those people that's never going to give up, well, I'm not going to give up on that person because it's just a matter of time. Because science, don't forget, because it was developed after astrology has been sort of recorded, I think that it can outperform astrology. So an IVF can work in a non-astrologically fertile time. It's just anecdotally in my practice happens more often when you're at a lucky time, but it can outperform the astrology. So I think if you have somebody who's got all of that personality and resources to go for it, I'm saying no chart will scare me that much. There are people with whom I feel like not only is their chart challenged, but they might have uncooperative partners. So they might have partners who are embarrassed about doing IVF and masturbating in a cup in a clinic and who just find it aberrant and who have religious problems with it. If you have an uncooperative partner, I start to lose a bit of faith because for most times people want to save their marriages and I fully appreciate that. So that's when I kind of I get a bit worried. And the other time I get a bit worried is when people are they're having the children for reasons other than themselves. So they're having children in order to save a marriage or in order to keep a marriage or in order to create material security in some way. And again, there's no judgment. But when people are doing that, they seemingly arrive and they are up for the appointment and they arrive for the IVF, but I can feel that their heart's not in it. If their chart is also not right, then I'm going, you don't have the guts to take this to the level to which it might take you to get pregnant. Yeah. So that's, and I will never anyway, sort of discount the potential for a miracle. Miracles happen, but I'm not going to give false hope.
Yep.
I usually tell people out of 10 being the worst, your chart is an X and it's dependent on you and the choices you make. But this is where we stand.
How do you counsel those couples who, even if they do all the things that you recommend and all the things their doctor recommends, it doesn't work? There's a limit to which even the best placebo, even the best science can function. Oh. And it seems like you might have to be one of the people who has one of those difficult conversations. Do you avoid those? Do you let the doctor do it? How do you handle that as a professional?
So the chances are that I've probably seen it, that it's going to be hard. So people say, how likely is it that I'm going to get pregnant? And like I said, out of 10, I'll give them a score. So if I give them a score of like 9 out of 10, this is like one of the worst charts I've seen. And sometimes I'll find better words to say that, but I will be saying, look, I am concerned. This is, you're 47. You don't want to try and, donor stuff. And now this is a problem. So what I will do is I'll try to dig around and say, like, what is the deal breaker situation here in your life? So I'm trying to get them to make a decision sooner rather than later, especially about donor egg or embryo, because your lucky chances kind of taper off after 46. So after 46, Venus can never ever touch your sun because Venus can't go more than 45 degrees away from your sun. So Venus can't touch your sun anymore by solar arc, which is like one of the classic signature for pregnancy. So I'm going, so we can't rely on that. There's a lot of like literal timing mechanisms that fall off, okay? Because naturally astrology is describing an aging process. So I want to say to people who are 42, okay, you've got a year to do 3 IVFs, but can we talk about donor egg? And I try and get them to have the conversation with their partners, because I say, and if you're not pregnant by here, then you should be considering donor egg there, because it takes 6 months to get your donor cycle up and running. So I don't want people to run out of their lucky time either while they're not really talking about donor egg. I'd rather they had the conversation. And some of the questions about donor egg I can answer immediately. Like a lot of people say, so how does it feel to be a donor recipient? And I say, I can put you in touch with people that can tell you. But I can also tell you what they have told me. And they've told me that for them, it was a deal breaker not to be a mom. So they decided that that's what they were going to do. And because they're using the husband's sperm, the baby comes out looking like the husband. So there's a familial kind of recognition. The baby also picks up mitochondrial DNA. So there is a contribution, and the baby's been in your tummy. And let me tell you, once you give birth to that, it feels as if were your own. Everybody needs to come to that decision-making process where's the deal breaker line? Like, where do you want to be 5 years from now? And I'm just trying to get them to stop having all of that irrelevant treatment with adjunct add-ons of stuff that's not really going to help them and wasting money and time. I want them to get, to that decision sooner with those kinds of charts.
So it's that decision. Where's my line? Where's my boundary? Who am I? What do I want? Those are the decisions that are hardest. The follow-on, how am I going to behave as a result of that, is not simple, but it's based in a pathway forward that is what you work out with your astrologer or with your doctor or whomever. But the initial, what do I want? Where are my boundaries? Is so tricky. One thing I heard in something that you've said in the past, not on this recording, but in the past, was that sometimes you can see in a chart when somebody's going to do it in a non-traditional way. And so I was always curious if you would see it in my chart, that choosing to be single. What shows up in a chart that says this person is not going to do it within the constructs of a traditional marriage, or they're going to do things in an unusual pattern?
Okay, so there are many astrological signatures that can actually hint at that. Yeah. So people who do things differently have planets that are in what we call detriment. So detriment is when a planet, for instance, Mars rules Aries, but when Mars is in Libra, that's called detriment because it's the furthest place away. It's 180 degrees away from Aries. It's as far away from home as possible. It's in exile. So when a planet is in exile, it's got to be really careful because you're in a foreign place and you've got to do things differently. And you're doing things out of the mainstream. You are just not in your own culture. You're just not in your own context. And so that's the world that you're living in and the space that you operate in. So in my particular astrology, I calculate the Unmutant of pregnancy, which is that long algorithm which gets to the one planet that has the most to say about you getting pregnant. And if that planet is also in detriment, I'm going, okay, so you're going to do it differently. And that might be that you have a baby at 15, which is culturally very different from your peer group. Or you might have a baby at 50, which is also culturally different from your peer group. Or you might have it with another woman, which you didn't expect. Or you might have to have IVF, which is not the natural way. So there are many ways that people do it differently. But if you've got one, and especially sometimes you've got even more planets in detriment. So some people have got the Unmutant in detriment, but they've also got 2 other personal planets that are in detriment. So that just means, okay, you've got what it takes to go into exile, to go to a foreign place and still make it.
Yeah, that's a really fun analogy. Well, let's talk about your path, because we started going down this path and then we got so excited about the work that you do. But as far as I understand your path, you were in a marriage that wasn't serving you. You discover astrology, you discover this other world, which now has become your profession and that's something that you've studied quite deeply. You've mentioned that you've got 2 kids and you've gone through IVF and you've got a second husband. Can you catch us up from the moment you discover astrology to where you are now? Just walk us through that part.
So I was divorced at about 29, which is a classic Saturn return. So at 29, 30, you get a return of your Saturn. And my Saturn is particularly angular in the first house, but it also reflects into the 7th. So I'm not surprised it was divorced, because that's just the way that Saturn works out. So that was that. And then I moved back to the city where my family was, and I started working as an interior designer. And then I met my second husband. And ironically, he is born in the same year, but 9 days before my first husband. So a lot of the same planetary lineups, but the change of time of his birth swung all the planets into a much better position. So our way of relating is like completely different. So that's also strange for me. That process was interesting.
So you met this new gentleman, and you mentioned that you were learning astrology at the time that you were also trying to conceive. What was that like? What was that like to dive into the self-reflection process and also try this conception process?
So I forgot to tell you, in the first marriage, because he was, like such a handful, and I got pregnant so quickly with my 2 first children. So my own mutant of pregnancy is connected to Uranus, which means unpredictable, also IVF. So I've had, like I said, you can have a bit of both. So my first marriage, completely unplanned, 2 unplanned pregnancies. And I thought, gosh, I can't have a third. So I actually had my tubes tied. So I actually closed the tuck shop.
Oh,
okay. At age 27. And I had my gynae, I had to convince him quite strongly to do that. But I said, no, I absolutely can't. Anyway, by the age of 29, I was divorced. It didn't faze me being divorced, because I always say, don't think that having a man is going to protect you from him leaving you later, even with a baby. So don't make your decision on family based on whether a man's going to be by your side or not, because we know better than to rely on that. So my children were 4, and they were 5 and 2, or 5 and 3, I think, when I met my second husband. And interestingly enough, he was a bachelor, had never been married before. He wasn't that keen on getting married, but he fell totally in love with my one daughter. He's got a Libra moon and she has a Libra sun. It was a cosmic match made in heaven, and that was it. So after several years of dating, and then finally I put the ultimatum. I said, look, I can't bear it. My children are now in love with you. Are you going to stay or are you going to go? So we then got married. And then I decided, well, do you want children? And so he was a bit shy about it, but I thought, no, well, I'll make myself available. So I went and had my tubes untied. So after having them tied, I had them untied.
Ouch.
It was a little bit ouch, but was quite successful. And we had a hysteroscopy afterwards and everything was quite clear. So I was quite confident. His sperm was 100%. I had a good history in my hormonal profile. I wasn't very old then. I was like 32. So that was quite good. And then we just fell into this unexplained infertility. So for 3 or 4 years, we were just trying Clomid and artificial inseminations. No one wanted to do IVF because there was no reason to do IVF. And it just didn't happen. Then I went on to, when I did go onto IVF, I suddenly had moved into my astrology to the degree that I was now studying it on a much deeper level. And I was exploring and experimenting with triplicity phase rulership, which is a way of looking at, our fertility life isn't static. So like my story, very fertile when young and not so fertile when older, like just over 30. And secondary infertility is a thing. So I was thinking that the Almutin of pregnancy maybe has a triplicity phase rulership, much like the ascendant has and how Guido Benatti used it. So I started applying that to the Almutin of pregnancy, and I saw that, I'd actually changed phase. And I was in a much worse phase than previously. So I went along to my fertility doctor and I said to him, Professor Kruger, you're very, very talented and you have a lovely clinic, but if I don't get pregnant, it's not your fault, it's my astrology. I mean, he just looked at my husband and said, what do I do with this? But it didn't work. So not that I was cut up. I mean, my youngest by then was 12 and the gap is huge. And having one, I might have had to have 2. And that would have been very busy. And I certainly wouldn't be here today that it worked. So it's kind of like, this is the paradox of life, isn't it? It's very hard to tell people who are still trying to have a baby that don't worry, there's a whole other life that is sometimes even richer and quite a lot more interesting on the other side. But it's true. I was fortunate in that I'd already had 2 children, so that burning desire or that feeling of fulfillment had already been a box that had already been ticked, and I had had a life experience that was satisfying with the kids. So it was not, I wouldn't say easy, but I could find a way to walk away from it. Of course, I left it too long, I think, and I was still hoping that something might happen naturally. So I kind of didn't close the door. So even like 5 years after that, I was still counting days, and I knew when I was ovulating, and I was far too, in it. And I think in those years, I kind of realized that I woke up one day and I just thought, you're just a grumpy old bitch. And I just thought, I didn't, this is a low grade depression. I was just grumpy. I was just permanently grumpy with the world. And it was just because every month there'd be this period. Now, while it wasn't a gutting disappointment, I almost didn't even have like a reason to break down and cry about it, but it just irritated you until you were just permanently grumpy. And that's when I took myself in hand and went, no, I'm going on the pill now so that there's no option for me to get pregnant. And ironically, I mean, most people say that they don't like being on the pill because they have a sort of a lessened sort of libido, or they don't feel quite themselves. I went on the pill and suddenly everything came back. Like I felt a normal life. I felt I could have sort of sex as a normal response and not just as a I'm ovulating response. And so, closing the door, drawing the line was a very good piece of advice for myself. And I think a lot of people who are in that phase where there's no decent reason, and so that time frame kind of can stretch. I just want to, warn people that depression can sneak up on you.
It's such an important message. It's an important message that the depression can be there hiding under the surface. And it's an important message that sometimes making a decisive action, even if it's counter to what you thought you wanted, can be freeing. The decision not to keep trying can be freeing sometimes. So you witness couples and individuals try to make babies all the time. And you yourself have gone through many phases in your family building journey. 2 kids, a decision not to keep trying for another, 2 marriages. At the end of the day, how does this inform what you think of as family? How do you define family?
Well, so quite a few people, and interestingly, it's older people. They ask me like, but there's some people that are just not suited to being parents, and how can you help them become parents when you know that they're not suitable? And sometimes the older generation feel that not suitable could be 2 gay men. Some people feel that not suitable is a single female mother. And some people feel not suitable is 2 gay women. So I kind of say to them, because children are born to lots of people all over the world all the time without any kind of endorsement, approval, or certificate of safety, it's like, why? Who's judging who? You know what I mean? There is no judge.
Yeah.
So if somebody comes to me and says, I want to have a baby and I need your services because, I want to get the timing right, I just go, well, you know what? That baby might want to be here. And who am I to judge? And, let me get you pregnant. It's just that. You want to be a parent and there's a baby that wants to be born. Let's find the time. Let's see if we can do this. We don't know who's good and who's bad and who's going to be a great mom or a bad mom. And in my particular personal world, there is no good or bad. There just is. And it's kind of like, this is your soul's journey, your soul's work. I'm not endorsing abuse. I'm not endorsing bad parents. I'm just saying it's nothing that we can stop, predict, and use as an excuse not to help somebody.
That's right. But I love this conversation. I could just keep talking to you forever. And I have referred you to a number of people, but I'm hoping that those people who are listening to this episode might take away a little hope that there might be some interesting stars aligned at the right time for them in their journey. They might take away a resource in you and your work. And I highly encourage them to reach out to you. If somebody is interested in working with you or reading your book, how do we get a hold of you? How do we find your work?
Okay, so I have a website, which is fertilityastrology.com. And I'm on Instagram, which is fertility.astrology. And you could just look up my name, Nicola Smuts Allsop, on Amazon, and you'll get to my book on Kindle and also to purchase it. Or you could click on my website, and there's also one on academic papers, and that has a link to other research or other papers that I have published.
The work that you do is so helpful. This placebo effect concept has really got me thinking quite a bit about other things in our lives that can be a placebo effect. Thank you so much for your time today.
Fine. Thank you so much for talking to me and give me the opportunity to talk about my work. I mean, it is something that I really, really love, and it's something that I'm passionate about. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.